Thank you so much. Thank you again to Joe and Sophia for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. And following the theme, I'll just share a personal anecdote, just a connection to the community. I do come from a military family, and my grandmother was a wave in the Navy and the Old Ironsides chapter. So very special to be here. I spent a couple years in Navy ROTC myself and then said no. But that led me to work in a couple of VAs and study PTSD. So I'm very happy to be here and talk to you all about the link between PTSD and cardiovascular disease. And I'll cover some of the same topics that Sophia and Ross have talked about. I don't have anything to disclose. Okay. Yeah, it is delayed. Okay. So as has been discussed, veterans and military personnel have higher rates of cardiovascular disease compared to the general population. So this includes myocardial infarction, strokes, heart failure, and hypertension. And most of this work has been epidemiological, so we know that there are higher rates of disease. I think a lot more progress is slowly being made on understanding how that's all happening. And of course, trauma and PTSD increase cardiovascular disease risk. And of course, our population is at high risk of trauma and PTSD. So this link is so compelling that the National Institutes of Health convened a working group in 2018 to really understand what is causing this, and what is the state of the literature, and what are some gaps and some opportunities for future research. One thing that's also been talked about a bit, and really, I think this is the center, at the core of this is the overactive stress response, but that is coupled with an underactive stress regulatory response. Okay. So we've talked about the normal stress response. So this is an adaptive response when you are dealing with a threat or challenge. Your amygdala is going to activate and perceive the threat. Your prefrontal cortex is helping you figure out what to do. So this is that fight or flight response. Am I going to run at the bear? Am I going to yell? Am I going to run away? What did I see on, National Geographic? That's what, the frontal parts of your brain are helping you try to figure out. But those parts of the brain are connected to the lower parts in the brainstem that project into your nervous system. So increasing your heart rate and your blood pressure to deal with what's going on, releasing those inflammatory cytokines. So all of this is good in the moment. It's protecting you from injury. But of course, we know that when that stress or challenge is a trauma, that can lead to PTSD, where the response starts going off when it's not supposed to. So you know that you're not actually in danger, but your body sort of feels like it is, and you're always on alert. So when this system is chronically activated, this leads to some of the things that Ross and Sophia talked about. So that cortisol resistance and really, ultimately, hypertension, I think, is actually a big, it's talked about as one of the mechanisms, but I do think it's really probably the biggest in terms of what it does downstream, which I'll talk about a little bit. So in PTSD, you have changes in the brain. So that overactive amygdala, which reflects that heightened stress response, like your heart rate. So too much fear, even when you're supposed to have fear, that response is too high, and decreased activity in the prefrontal parts of the brain. So inability to sort of tamp that down or put the brakes on when you know that it's okay. And the three mechanisms that my group is studying are autonomic dysfunction, so your heart rate, blood pressure, heart rate variability, inflammation, and vascular dysfunction. So again, you have PTSD leading to these changes in the brain and downstream into other parts of your body. And we see this as the ultimate link to cardiovascular disease or events. So when you have overt disease, heart attacks and strokes. And so autonomic dysfunction predicts cardiovascular disease. So we've talked a lot about high blood pressure, elevated heart rate, which is a part of your blood pressure, and lowered heart rate variability So heart rate variability or vagal control, that is the nerve that goes from your brainstem down to your heart and actually regulates your heartbeat. And so when that variability is lower, it's like you're less flexible to your environment, and your cardiovascular system is being strained. We've seen in our Mass General Brigham Biobank that not only does PTSD associate with increased risk for cardiovascular disease, or in this case, MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, but that it does so through heart rate variability. So PTSD likely leads to worse parasympathetic or vagal control, and that's one of the contributing factors to cardiovascular events. And then inflammation, we've also talked about a bit. So this is a very hot topic lately. And when we're talking about inflammation, we're talking about cytokines that are in the blood, but also tissues throughout the body. So this is a recent paper from our group showing that inflammation in the arteries, so atherosclerotic inflammation, and in the bone marrow, which is leukopoiesis, is much higher in those with PTSD compared to controls, both healthy and trauma exposed. So it's not just the trauma, it's the PTSD. To, I think, the point about resilience. So yes, trauma exposure increases risk of a number of things, but PTSD has its own specific negative effect. This is just an image of the leukopoiesis. So on the right, you can see much more inflammation lit up. This is with an FDG PET imaging protocol. So we're using radiation to light up essentially the inflammatory tissues. And so you can see heightened inflammation. This is in an individual who went on to develop cardiovascular disease. And then vascular dysfunction. So vascular dysfunction is a pretty broad category. Mostly we're talking about the inner part of the blood vessel. So how well does that blood vessel expand in response to change in blood flow? What you're seeing here is a non-invasive ultrasound. So one way to measure this is just to use a simple blood pressure cuff, and you're measuring the diameter of the blood vessel before and after you cut off blood supply. So when you get that feeling of pins and needles when the blood is rushing back through, what we're seeing is how well does your blood vessel change or grow in response to that change in blood flow. So very, very strong indicator of cardiovascular health and disease, and really early. So I want to emphasize that a lot of the markers we're using are things that aren't necessarily used clinically, because these are processes that take years to develop, but the tools that we have can see really early signs of disease where we can still intervene. I'm a psychologist, so I'm interested in primary and secondary prevention before someone is in a cardiologist's office. And one of the things our group found was that essentially if you have a double hit, so poor vagal control, that low heart rate variability, that the association between your PTSD symptoms and your vascular function was even stronger. So some research questions that we're interested in. Number one, does PTSD treatment improve CVD risk? So again, this is where my clinical side comes in. I want to know, what can we actually do, again, before somebody is seeing a cardiologist? We have some existing really good gold standard treatments that work for a lot of people. If you improve the PTSD, do you improve these mechanisms and ultimately reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease? So again, before somebody has developed overt CVD. And then what mechanisms might treatment be impacting? So I mentioned autonomic function, inflammation, and vascular function. So do these treatments actually improve those mechanisms, and can we connect that to reduce incidence of disease? There are treatments that show promise for this. I think we've just been limited by some smaller trials and some more surface level measures. So heart rate and blood pressure are good, but things like vascular function and the inflammation markers we can get from imaging are just much more sensitive, and you can see disease much earlier. So this is really a big area of interest for our group. And then, of course, can we mitigate that early risk and prevent disease incidence? So a little bit about our current research. So we're really interested in whether psychotherapy, so we're using something called cognitive processing therapy. It's an evidence-based cognitive behavioral treatment for PTSD. Can this reduce the sort of stress neural activity in the brain? Can it improve prefrontal brain functioning? And does that have these downstream effects? So we're looking at, do you see improvement in these mechanisms, autonomic dysfunction, inflammation, and do you see changes in the brain? And can you actually show statistically like that one is leading to the other, showing that the brain and the heart are inherently connected, as we know that they are? So if you can actually improve things in the brain, is that helping to lead to these other improvements in the body? So this is a study funded by the American Heart Association, and we're recruiting individuals with PTSD symptoms and cardiovascular risk. So folks with hypertension or diabetes, for example. That's actually one of the limitations to prior work. I think it's been in PTSD samples, but not necessarily people who are showing some early signs of risk. So we're really hoping to get our target sample here. And this is the FDG PET imaging protocol I was talking about. I know it's kind of hard to see, but essentially it's a couple hours long, and what it's doing, I'll go to the next slide so you can really appreciate, you are simultaneously imaging the brain, the carotids, the peripheral arteries, and the bone marrow. So in one long session, you're really seeing at the same time what's going on in the brain and these peripheral systems. So it's a really unique protocol, a really great way to see all of these different organ systems. So on the right side, you have an individual who eventually went on to have cardiovascular disease. And at the top right, they had higher amygdala activity. In the middle, they had higher inflammation in the aorta. And then on the bottom right is that bone marrow activity from the spine. So we're doing this pre and post treatment. So again, just summarizing the measures that we're using here and how we're hoping to really show this brain-heart connection, and that we can leverage that connection with some of our existing treatments. But of course, we're interested as well in what's next and what else can we do here. So we've submitted applications for larger NIH-funded trials where we're hoping to add measures of the vasculature that I mentioned, and also include both sexes and look at sex differences, because the vasculature is different in different people. Men are more likely to have macrovascular diseases, so diseases of the bigger blood vessels, probably no surprise, and women have smaller blood vessels, so smaller microvascular disease. So PTSD is leading to cardiovascular disease in everyone, but probably through different pathways, and particularly on the cardiovascular side, leading to different types of cardiovascular disease. So we really need to have a sex-specific lens in all of this. And then we're interested in other treatments. So whether in alone or in combination, one is breath work. So a lot of you are probably familiar with box breathing. This is just one of many different exercises that triggers that vagus nerve and increases your heart rate variability. And then exercise. So gold standard behavioral intervention for reducing your cardiovascular risk, and also has beneficial effects on PTSD symptoms. So we really want to know, for some folks, is one or other of these better or worse? Is their combination better for some people? Really trying to identify who's going to be best suited for which treatment or which combination of treatments, because they're getting at things from different ways, but ultimately the brain and the heart are being affected by all of these treatments. So if we combine them, do we really magnify the beneficial effects? And then ultimately that long-term follow-up. So do we actually reduce the incidence of cardiac events? And just want to acknowledge some funding sources, and thank you again.